Welcome back. In this lesson, we are going to do a deeper dive into the useEffect hook. Now, we don't actually need to use some of the functionality that we're about to talk about, but it's good for us to, at the very least, cover it so that we're aware. Now, when we think about our useEffect hook, with useEffect, we actually can pass back a function from the function that we pass it. So what do I mean by this? Well, let's say we were using our useEffect hook. We did something, and we are able to return a function from this function. This function that we return is what's called a cleanup function. And a cleanup function is what useEffect calls when the component unmounts. So it's our way of replicating the lifecycle method component will unmount. Now, why would we want something like this? Well, before we implemented our sagas, if you remember, the way that we were using and subscribing to our Firestore was we were using their subscription methods in order to provide listeners and get snapshots. So if you remember what we were doing, we were pretty much bringing in the Firestore library into our component and pretend this is a class component. What we had to do is we had to say unsubscribe from collections was equal to null, right? Because we were setting some class method that we were storing the value of inside of our component didMount lifecycle method. And we were saying this dot unsubscribe from collections was equal to firestore.collection collections dot on snapshot. And then we would pass it the callback, where we would get the snapshot and we would do something with it. After that, we had to actually unsubscribe, right? Inside of component will unmount. And this was our way of cleaning up from our listener. Right? This was the pattern we had to do using this observer pattern of listening to on snapshot. Well, if we wanted to replicate this inside of a classless component, using useEffect, that's the whole point of this return function. So I'll show you how we'll do it. So what we would do is, let's say right here in our useEffect, we say I am subscribing, just so that we can log it and see what happens. We call firestore.collection using our collections, and then we say on snapshot, we take the snapshot, and we simply console log it. That's all we do. In fact, we don't even need the async because we're just console logging in this function. Now, what we do is we set some const unsubscribe. Oh, can't spell today. Unsubscribe from collections is equal to this object, right? Because we still need to store the unsubscribe function we get back from on snapshot. What we would do, however, is inside of our cleanup function, we could call the unsubscribe right here. In fact, we'll also console.log I am unsubscribing. And now we only want to initialize this subscription on our mounting, right? After we've mounted. So we, of course, pass the empty array to indicate that we only want to use this effect when it mounts. But we also want to call this return function when our component unmounts. So this will call regardless of whether or not we pass this function in. If we pass it a cleanup function, useEffect will call the cleanup function when the component unmounts. So now if we go to a collection page, right here, we'll see we get our I am subscribing. We subscribe to our collection and we get a snapshot. And if that collection ever changes while we're still listening to it, and let's say a new object comes in, right, or an object changes, right, we'll get a new snapshot and then we'll do our console log, we'll fire again. So this is the subscriptor model. But let's say we unmount this collection page component by going to the home page. Well, we see that our cleanup function got fired. So I am unsubscribing gets fired, and our unsubscribe will also get called. So that's the whole purpose of a cleanup function. The cleanup function is meant to mimic any component will unmount, right? Which allows you to clean up your effect. So that's pretty much the main thing about what you want to return from useEffect. This is also why when we used that async function and we passed it in, the useEffect gave us that warning that said we were not allowed to pass it anything other than a function that will represent a cleanup function. So that's pretty much why. It's because the only thing that useEffect expects a function to return to useEffect is a function that it will call when the component unmounts. In the future, whenever you need to possibly leverage the useEffect hook inside of your component and you need to use component will unmount, well, now you know how to do it using this cleanup function. Now we can remove this useEffect from our component because we don't actually need it given how our application was built. We added that code solely to explain the cleanup function. But now our component is still leveraging hooks in those previous two lessons that we did where we converted using useEffect and useState to replace our components and make them functional components. So now let's just make sure to commit our code. So we'll see what we did. We know that we updated our application app component, sign in component, and sign up component to use hooks. We'll push that up and move on with our lessons.